Now, for people who are struggling to understand jazz theory, tritone substitution sounds scary. Even if you understand the basic concept, you could be in the dark when it comes to how to apply it. So I'm going to try to shed a little light on both the concept and the application. Now we need to take a look at the note that turns the major triad into a dominant 7 chord, the flat 7. When a note in one chord is a half step away from a note in the next chord, that creates a strong sense of resolution. Now the major scale contains 2 half steps, between 7 and 1 and between 3 and 4. The 7th note of a major scale is the 3rd of the 5 chord, and the 4th note of the major scale is the flat 7th of the 5 chord. So when we play G7 going to C major, the F pulls toward the E just as strongly as the B pulls toward the C. In the last example, we saw the notes of the tritone move away from each other, a half step in each direction to produce the resolution. If we invert the tritone, putting the 3rd on the bottom and the 7 on the top, which is the way it appears if the chord is in root position, then the cheeseburger notes move inwards. The 7th of the 5 chord moves down to the 3rd of the 1 chord, and the 3rd of the 5 chord moves up to the root of the 1 chord. So every tritone can resolve in 2 directions, inwards or outwards. If you invert the tritone and then you resolve in the opposite direction, you get the same resolution. Now let's look at what happens if we don't invert the tritone, but we move the notes in the opposite direction. Going back to the first example, the 3rd of the 5 chord moved up and the 7th moved down. If we reverse this movement, we wind up with an F sharp and an A sharp, so clearly this is not a C major chord. However, it is still a root and a 3rd of a major chord, in this case an F sharp major chord. This is where we start to see how tritone substitution works. If we start with the notes F and B and resolve them outwards, we get a C major chord. If we resolve them inwards, we get an F sharp major chord. You may have picked up on the fact that C major and F sharp major are also a tritone apart. And what that shows us is that every tritone resolves in 2 different directions to 2 different chords, a tritone apart. This is one of the ramifications of the interval being symmetrical. Here's another way to look at it. When we see F and B resolving inwards to F sharp and A sharp, well, that implies a chordal movement of G7 to F sharp major. That's a tritone substitution for the normal 5-to-1 resolution in the key of F sharp. The G7 is substituting for the normal 5 chord in the key of F sharp, which is C sharp dominant 7. Now, what are the cheeseburger notes of a C sharp dominant 7 chord? E sharp is the 3rd, and B natural is the 7th. Now, since E sharp and F are the same notes, that means that these 2 dominant 7 chords share the same cheeseburger notes. The 3rd of one is the 7th of the other, and vice versa. This is why 2 dominant chords, a tritone apart, can substitute for each other. Because the tritone interval between the cheeseburger notes, which defines the dominant quality and sets up the resolution, is the same in both chords. The only difference is the root motion. If, as we're seeing in this demonstration, the only notes we hear are the root 3rd and 7th, well then the substitution is clear-cut. You change the bass note, and you've changed the chord progression. Once we add other notes, however, there's more to consider. While a G7 chord and a C sharp 7 chord share the same 3rd and 7th, the root and the 5th are quite different. These notes are the buns in the cheeseburger analogy. They're not as important as the 3rd and the 7th, but they can't be ignored entirely. There are also the other notes of the scale to consider. The keys of C major and F sharp major are just about as different as they can be. So it's not as simple as using either dominant chord in either key. You need to understand the effects of doing so, both in terms of voicing the chords and in constructing melodic lines over them.